Good morning. Good morning and welcome. Find a seat if you can. That looks like it is a difficult task this morning. At WCC, we say that we have an integrated program. And on a very sort of mundane and practical level, that means that all students take all the same courses. So for a member of the class of 2026, for example, we know that such a person has read the Iliad, the Odyssey, has read Plato's Republic, has read all 900 something pages of the Brothers Karamazov, and has also stood in front of a whiteboard in various degrees of fear and trembling to demonstrate Euclidean propositions, perhaps even the fabled Death Star. But there's more to being an integrated program than simply taking all the same classes, which is a wonderful thing, and one of the reasons those of us who teach here love teaching here. But there's more to it than that. We believe that knowledge is unified, and that the different disciplines have things to say to each other. That theology can speak to math and science, that humanities can speak to philosophy, for example, and so on and so forth. And one of the reasons I have really appreciated advising this project and seeing it come to fruition is that what Mr. Sidloski here is doing is something that is quintessentially WCC. I think he is making a variety of disciplines speak to each other, and I think you will be greatly edified by the results that he is about to present to you in this oration entitled, Do Your Own Close Reading, The Poet as Rhapsode of Creation. Please join me in welcoming Mr. James Sidloski.
Thank you, Dr. Hill, for that kind introduction. Thank you also for being my advisor for this thesis and oration project. It's been really incredible to be able to have this conversation and delve into this subject with you and get all your feedback on my thoughts. Thank you, Dr. Holmes, for being my second reader and also for the conversations that we have had on this subject as well. And thank you, Dr. Judd, for being my third panelist and also for having conversations with me and helping me out with the theological parts of my thesis. And thank you all for being here today. Let's begin with a prayer. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Angel of God, my guardian dear, to whom God's love commits me here, ever this day be at my side, till I depart. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Was that a poem that we all just said together? Why would we think it's a poem? It has lines that are metrical and that rhyme. That's about all that it has going for it for being a poem, I think, though. Is that all that it takes up to make something a poem? What is poetry? I was first prompted to ponder this question for myself my freshman year in a theology class when President Washut told us that God writes poetry with things. And I thought that was a really interesting statement for, well, it seems to say something really interesting both about things and about poetry, about things that maybe there's something about them that they indicate more than just what they seem, and about poetry that maybe there's something that all poetry does beyond just the appearance and the meter and rhyme. And then when I turned to think about poems that I love, it seemed true that there's something unifying them all above and beyond just having lines in meter and rhyme. And if we turn to Aristotle, he can concur with this idea that poetry is something beyond merely meter and rhyme. In quote 1 from the Poetics, Aristotle says, "You might put the whole work of Herodotus into verse, and it would still be a species of history. The historian describes the thing that has been, and the poet a kind of thing that might be. Hence, poetry is something more philosophic and of greater import than history, since its statements are of the nature rather of universals, whereas those of history are singulars." As Aristotle says, just to transpose Herodotus's history into verse wouldn't make it poetry. There's something else that's going on with poetry. We can think of a couple other examples of, say, Lucretius or certain pre-Socratic philosophers who wrote their philosophic treatises in verse, but we wouldn't for that reason say that they had written a poem. It is still a work of philosophy, even though it's written in a kind of poetic style. But also note something else that Aristotle is saying here. He says poetry is something more philosophic and more universal than history. History describes a particular thing that has happened in the past as something over and done with, something that we can learn from, but something that has happened in the past, whereas poetry, even if it is describing a real historical event, does it in the light of something, something that might be, rather than something that has been, something that might be and might be again. Aristotle goes further into this question in quote 2 of what it is that really makes up poetry. Again, from the Poetics, he says, "It is a great thing, indeed, to make a proper use of these poetical forms, as also of compounds and strange words. But the greatest thing by far is to be a master of metaphor. It is the one thing that cannot be learned from others, and it is also a sign of genius, since a good metaphor implies an intuitive perception of the similarities in dissimilars." This, as Aristotle is saying, is the most important thing for writing poetry over the poetical forms and compounds and strange words that make poetry delightful to read. It's really the metaphor that is poetical in a poem. This thing that shows us the similarity between things that we wouldn't necessarily think of as connected. And Wordsworth takes this idea of seeing the similarities and dissimilarities even further in his preface to his lyrical ballads in quote 3. He says, he's speaking here of the pleasure that we get from reading poetry. And he says, "I mean the pleasure which the mind derives from the perception of similitude in dissimilitude. This principle is the life of our ordinary conversation. And upon the accuracy with which similitude in dissimilitude and dissimilitude in similitude are perceived, depend our taste and moral feelings." Wordsworth is saying something here about language as a whole. When we use words, we're always saying that this thing is like this other thing or is not like this other thing. But whereas in ordinary conversation, we do this on a very superficial and usually utilitarian level, with poetry, we do it almost at a metaphysical level. If I were to say in ordinary conversation, the podium is brown, I'm not really conveying much meaning that you couldn't figure out by yourself. But if a poet were to have something like that in his poem, the podium is brown, because of the context in which it is, since it's in a poem, we're expecting the poet to be using his words very carefully. And so we would think of all sorts of aspects or attributes that we ascribe to podium and all sorts of attributes that we ascribe to brown, and think about this in a very deep way in order to really understand all that the poet is meaning to convey. That's a very poor example, but hopefully you get the idea. I'd like to turn now to a couple of examples from poetry of metaphors being used. But first, I want to draw a distinction between two different kinds of metaphor. Explicit and implicit metaphor. An explicit metaphor is a metaphor that says, this thing is like this other thing. My God is a rock. And an implicit metaphor, on the other hand, doesn't say that something is like something else. It merely gives us an image and invites us through that image to ponder some deeper mystery or reality. So I'll give a couple examples now to show how this is working. Quote 4 is the second and last stanza of Emily Dickin's poem, Tell All the Truth But Tell It Slant. And this is an example of an explicit metaphor. She says, as lightning to the children eased with explanation kind, the truth must dazzle gradually or every man be blind. Dickinson is talking here about the way in which humans must come to know the truth. We must come to it by a sort of circuitous route, because if we were to face the full reality of truth all at once, it would be so shocking and overpowering that we wouldn't even believe that it is actually true. We need to come to know it a little bit at a time so that we can piece the whole together and come to know it in its fullness. And she's saying, just as that's the way for us as humans coming to know the truth, even so with children, with something scary like lightning, you need to have some gentle explanation so that you don't unduly frighten them and overwhelm what they know with their limited knowledge by an explanation that will just frighten them and that they won't even understand. So we can see the metaphor that she's using is being mapped directly onto this idea, the main idea of her poem that she wants us to think about. Now, if we turn to quote 5, Flower in the Crannied Wall by Tennyson, we can see an example of an implicit metaphor. Flower in the crannied wall, I pluck you out of the crannies. I hold you here, root and all, in my hand, little flower. But if I could understand what you are, root and all in all, I should know what God and man is. The first thing to do with an implicit metaphor is to pay close attention to the way that the poet is presenting the surface level, because the full meaning of the metaphor is dependent on the strength and the accuracy with which the poet presents the surface level. So we can see that in this poem, the speaker sees a flower growing out of a crack of a wall, and he pulls it out in order to look at it, root and all, as he says, and realizes that he can't simply know what it is just by itself. To know what the flower is would involve a knowledge of the entire cosmos and even God himself. But if we dig deeper into the metaphor, we can see how this message comes through so much more strongly. We start with the image of the flower, something beautiful, delicate, useless, natural, and it's growing out of a crack in an old, ugly, useful man-made wall. So the speaker has this experience of delicate beauty that has somehow managed to grow out and survive in the midst of this ugly utility. And so, marveling at it, he pulls it out in order to discover what it is, to see not only the beautiful part that presents itself, but also the root that underlies and supports that beauty. But looking at it, he can see it root and all. But to know what it is, root and all in all, as he says, he would need to know what the entire cosmos is. And this comes through especially strongly in the last line where he says, if I could understand what you are, root and all in all, I should know what God and man is. Not, I should know what God and man are, as we might expect in order to keep with the rules of conventional grammar, but what God and man is, and that is reinforcing this idea of the unity of all existence being held together by God. So now, with an understanding of poetry as something that uses metaphor to convey truth, I think we're in a place where we can turn to creation to see how it is a poem that God has written about himself. And the first place I'd like to look For this is to St. Thomas Aquinas's Compendium Theologiae. In quote 6, he says, "All perfections found in anything at all must originally and superabundantly be present in God. For whatever moves something to perfection must possess in itself the perfection it confers on others, as a teacher has in his own mind the knowledge he hands on to others. Therefore, since God is the first mover and moves all things toward their perfections, all perfections found in things must pre-exist in him abundantly." All perfections must come from God. And in that way, we can see how created things are are implicit metaphors for God. By looking at the perfections that he has placed in things, we can be drawn into a contemplation of his own perfection. And this is true not only on an individual level of created things, but even more so when we contemplate a lot of things together and the ways that they interact and affect each other. As he says in quote 7, "Since the divine goodness could not be adequately represented by one creature alone, on account of the distance that separates every creature from God, it had to be represented by many creatures, so that what is lacking in one might be supplied by another." We can think of a symphony, and in the way that each instrument in the orchestra has its own part to play in bringing the symphony to reality. And we can just listen to and appreciate what each instrument is doing on its own. But it's so much better and more beautiful and grand when we hear it all played together, when the whole symphony comes together. But even so, this image is somewhat helpful, but not even all of God's creation is adequate to represent his utter unified perfection. It's not capable of conveying the full symphony of God's perfection, simply because of the because of the limitation of creation, the finitude. Now we can see a similar idea, just from a slightly different perspective, in St. Augustine's De Doctrina. In quote 8, he says, "A thing is that which is not used to signify something else. Signs are things used to signify something. Thus every sign is also a thing, but not every thing is also a sign." This is so simple it might almost look complicated. Augustine is simply saying that we can look at anything in two different respects. We can look at it either as a thing or as a sign that points to something beyond what it merely appears to be on the surface. Then he goes on to draw a distinction between enjoyment and use in quote 9. He says, "To enjoy something is to cling to it with love for its own sake. To use something, however, is to employ it in obtaining that which you love, provided that it is worthy of love. We should use this world and not enjoy it, so that the invisible things of God, being understood by the things that are made, may be seen. That is, so that by means of corporal and temporal things, we may comprehend the eternal and spiritual." Augustine here is saying that we need to see things as metaphors. We need to not only see them as things, of course that is necessary in certain contexts where we need to use things, but we also need to wonder at them and see them as the signs that they are pointing to God. We need to not enjoy them in themselves, but to relate them to God and to use them in order to enjoy God through them. If we are to be said in any sense to enjoy them in themselves, we can only mean that we're enjoying them insofar as they are signs pointing to the transcendent. St. Athanasius helps us to further see how this is so in De Incarnatione. In quote 10, he says, "Being good, he bestowed on them his own image, so that understanding through such grace the image, I mean the word of the Father, they might be able to receive through him a notion of the Father, and knowing the Creator, they might live the happy and truly blessed life. But knowing the weakness of human beings, God anticipated also their carelessness, so that if they cared not to recognize God through themselves, through the works of creation, they might not be ignorant of their Creator. But since the negligence of humans descended gradually to lower things, God again anticipated such weakness of theirs, sending the law and the prophets known to them, so that if they shrank from looking up to the heavens and knowing the Creator, they might have instruction from those close by. St. Athanasius, which you'll probably remember if you've read this already, if you've read De Incarnatione, is very concerned with this turning in the fall, man's turning away from the good, which is being, to evil, which is non-being, which sets mankind on this steep trajectory down into non-being, from which he's helpless to stop himself. And as he says here, through the fall, our ability to see the transcendent through ourselves, who are by our very nature a kind of intersection of the material and spiritual, and also from the beauties in creation. Our perception has been fractured, and we're no longer able to see things for the metaphors that they are, pointing to God. And we are left only with the law and the prophets as guides to point us to salvation. St. Athanasius goes on to say in quote 11, "For the Son, who by his own providence and ordering of the universe teaches about the Father, his it was to renew the same teaching. How could this be done? Perhaps one might say that it was possible through the same means, so as to show the things concerning him through the works of creation. But this was no longer certain. Human beings had neglected this before, and no longer were their eyes held upwards but downwards." Our eyes are no longer held upwards but downwards. We no longer have ingrained in our nature an impulse to see the divine through the material, but we now are focused downwards onto the mere physical appearances of things. Fulton Sheen says this very well in under slightly different terms in his book, Lift Up Your Heart, in quote 12. He says, "It is said that one has a sense of humor if he can see the point, and that he lacks a sense of humor if he cannot see the point. But God has made the world in such a way that he is the point of everything. The material is meant to be a revelation of the spiritual, the human a revelation of the divine, and the fleeting experiences of our days a revelation of eternity. Everything created was to tell something about God, for by the invisible things of the world is the invisible made manifest. According to this plan, every man was to be a poet, a humorist, a man endowed with a sense of the invisible infinite values in everything. The slip which destroyed man's role in creation was sin, and sin is a disproportionate seriousness. Sin was the act by which man refused to see creatures for what they were, stepping stones to God, a means to an end, and began instead to clutch at them as ends in themselves. Sin is this act where we fail to see God as the point of everything, where we see things merely as the way that they appear to us or use them for our own ends. And paradoxically, it's when we do this, when we try to see things as all important merely in themselves, that we strip them of their most important meaning. As he says, we're meant to be poets, humorists, men endowed with a sense of the invisible infinite values in everything. But things only have invisible infinite values when they are related to something transcendent, to the divine perfection of which they are reflections. Now, this problem of not being able to see the metaphor in things seems to be getting worse. According to Joseph Pieper, writing in Learning How to See Again in 1952, he says in quote 13, "Man's ability to see is in decline. We do not mean here, of course, the physiological sensitivity of the human eye. We mean the spiritual capacity to perceive the visible reality as it truly is." Joseph Pieper goes on to speculate on the causes of this problem. And one thing that seems to be making it more prevalent in our modern times is something he terms visual noise, which, just like audio noise, which makes it difficult to concentrate in a noisy environment, makes it difficult for us to give our full attention to the things that deserve it, just in our everyday lives. We live in a culture that is constantly sending us a flood of stimuli that takes up our full attention and prevents us from focusing for any great length on a single thing. But there's constantly things coming at us that we need to take hold of and use for needs that we have or needs that we believe we have. Pieper, and this mode of life is fundamentally opposed to the slower, more contemplative mode that we must live in if we are to take the time to fully appreciate the things around us as they fully deserve. Pieper goes on to talk about what we need to do to get out of this situation. And he first of all talks about going into a fast, which we all love here at WCC, where we put ourselves in an environment where we don't have so much of a flood of stimuli coming at us, and we are able to take more time to contemplate the situations around us. But then he goes on to say in quote 14, "A better and more effective remedy is this: to be active oneself in artistic creation, producing shapes and forms for the eye to see. Nobody has to observe and study the visible mystery of a human face more than the one who sets out to sculpt it in a tangible medium. And this holds true not only for a manually formed image. The verbal image as well can thrive only when it springs from a higher level of visual perception. We sense the intensity of observation required simply to say, 'The girl's eyes were gleaming like wet currants,' from Tolstoy." As he says, when we engage in artistic creation ourselves, it requires us to have a very intimate encounter with the subject which we want to represent. In order to accurately portray it to our audience, we need to know it very well ourselves. And so it requires a very dedicated attentiveness to whatever it is that we are representing. And again, as he says, this is not only true for the manually formed image, but also for the verbal image. And I would say it's even more true for the verbal image. It seems to me that the range that words are able to portray, and even the depth in certain respects that words are able to portray, is greater than what can be done merely through physical imagery. For example, for actions and emotions, there's a lot that can be conveyed through sculpture or painting, but it seems like there's a lot more that can be done with those things when you're using words. Now, this is a smooth as butter transition to my title, which is Do Your Own Close Reading, The Poet as Rhapsode of Creation. If we think of creation as God's poem about himself, then our own poetry that we write is a way of doing a kind of close reading on God's poem. It's a way of intimately interacting with that poem. When we write poetry, we become kind of sub-creators within the order that God has made, creating within the realm and with the things that he has placed around us, but using our own intellect and imagination to present, as Aristotle says, things that might happen. We become rhapsodes of creation. Well, what is a rhapsode? A rhapsode in ancient Greece was someone who would give dramatic recitations of someone's poetry. And Plato has a dialogue between Socrates and a Homeric rhapsode named Ion. And they're talking about this curious fact that poets seem to be able to write about all sorts of different things, and no one really knows how they know all about these things. It seems like they know about so much that even if someone were to try to study all the things that poets talk about, you couldn't even actually do that in your entire lifetime. But poets seem to just be able to write about all these different things with so much knowledge. And Socrates suggests that this is not because they're writing through any kind of knowledge or mastery of their subjects themselves. He says it's because they are possessed by the god. And he gives this image of a magnetic stone in quote 15. It's a divine power that moves you, as a magnetic stone moves iron rings. This stone not only pulls those rings, if they're iron, it also puts power in the rings, so that they in turn can do just what the stone does, pull other rings, so that there's sometimes a very long chain of iron pieces and rings hanging from one another. The spectator is the last of the rings, the middle one is you, the rhapsode or actor, and the first one is the poet himself. The god pulls people's souls through all these wherever he wants, looping the power down from one to another. And that's the image I'd like to leave you with for the human poet. As the rhapsode of creation, the rhapsode of God's poem, who is moved by this magnetic power within creation and moved by that writes his own poetry to explicate the full meaning of God's creation, so that we too can appreciate it, come to a greater appreciation of it ourselves. And so I'd also like to leave you with an exhortation to not only read the works of the great poets who have spent so much time and dedication and attention to reading closely into God's metaphors, but also to read into God's metaphors yourselves and write your own poetry. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We will begin with questions from our panel, and then we'll turn things over to the audience.
Great. Yeah, I have a few questions, James. That was delightful. Thank you. So when Father Deacon President Dr. Probatus Kyle Washington said that God writes poetry with things, was that a metaphor?
Was his
that
statement a metaphor? Yes, I think so.
Okay. So we're saying there's a likeness between what God does and poetry.
Between God's act as creator and the poet's act as poet.
Okay, great. Do meter and rhyme have anything to do with anything?
Yes. Yeah. Connected to your first question, the act that is similar between God and the poet is that they're using their medium with which they're conveying truth in a similar way. They're using it in a metaphorical way, so that they're not only giving us an image to be appreciated in itself, but they're giving us an image which, by the very image that it is something that through which we're able to come to a more remote but a deeper kind of knowledge. And the way that meter and rhyme do this in a poem, I already mentioned, first of all, that I maybe didn't mention this explicitly actually, but they cue the reader of a poem into the fact that it is poetry, and that the poet is therefore using his words very carefully and using them metaphorically. But then also, there's something really cool about the way that the kind of tropes that we see in poetry, like rhyme, which uses similar but dissimilar words, because rhymes are words that have similar endings, right? But usually different meanings. So just within the medium with which the poet is communicating, he's doing the metaphorical thing with his words, and same with like other tropes and with I forget what it's called when you start a word with the same letter.
Alliteration.
Alliteration, yeah, sorry. Yeah, but does that?
No, that's helpful. So this is not a question. This first part, I'll just go out and make my own crazy claim for just a moment. I take the upshot of science to be that God's poetry has meter. Do things rhyme?
Yes, I think. Yeah, I think it's hard. Even though the poet is doing something, even though the poet and God are doing something similar in their creative and sub-creative acts, I don't know how much we want to map directly what the poet is doing onto what God is doing. I think most essentially they're using metaphor, and I think that does hold pretty equally for both of them, though, yeah, God does it in a much more profound way. But as for rhyme, yeah, there are probably things that you could point to in creation and say this is kind of like things rhyming. But yeah, there would probably be a lot of different things you could point to as saying that. I don't know. Maybe you could come up with some rigorous structure for creation system of saying this sort of thing when you see it in creation is kind of like meter in a poem, and this sort of thing is kind of like rhyme and stuff like that. But
all right, yeah, thanks for exploring that with me. I guess last question before I hand it off. I don't want to be greedy. I wanted to just get a little bit of clarity about the nature of the claim you're making about metaphor in relation to poetry. Are you saying that every poem that can actually be called a poem without exception will use metaphor? And I could, for example, go through the book of Psalms, scanning them to see which ones use metaphor. And if I come across one that uses neither explicit or implicit metaphor, I can say safely, this one is not a poem, because poetry must use metaphor. That is the nature of poetry all the time. Is that the nature of the claim?
Yeah, that is.
I'm not challenging the claim. I'm just asking what the claim is.
Yeah. I don't think I would say that. I don't think I'm trying to come up with a system of categorization by which we can take everything and say this is a poem and this isn't. I'm more trying to point to, if we were to find something that we call like poetic, I think it would be the use of metaphor. I know that there are probably plenty of examples of things that we would call poetry that don't use metaphor, and Aristotle talks about that too in the Poetics. But I think that poetry, when best done, does make use of meter and rhyme and metaphor.
Okay, that's very helpful.
I think, yeah, there are a lot of things that we attribute to poetry, and yeah, okay, they don't all need to be always present.
Thank you.
Thank you, James. I want to sort of pick up on that line a little bit here. Yeah, you said at one point early on in your oration that metaphor is what is poetical in a poem. You just said something similar a minute ago. You had noted also at the beginning that for many of us, or for maybe for little kids, there's a kind of equivalence often between verse and poetry. But of course, you said the two are not the same. Not every verse rendition, your quotation about Herodotus was right. Not any verse rendition of a text makes it to be poetry necessarily. Nor, on the other hand, is it the case that every genuine poem, even every good poem, must be in verse necessarily. We have, the sort of more modern approach to poetry. We see sometimes of different variations on free verse. I'm wondering. So in other words, just to say, it seems like metaphor is something really central or essential to what makes poetry, or to what makes something poetic. I wonder, though, if you could say more about what the connection is between verse and poetry. I recognize that every poem need not be in verse. But I wonder, why do we have that sort of innate connection between verse and poetry in our minds? And why is it that the emergence of free verse is a really new kind of thing in poetry? 200 years ago, you wouldn't have had anyone sort of thinking about poetry except in the terms of some kind of verse. So is it, in other words, I guess, is it the case that people's idea of what poetry is has changed? Has the nature of poetry changed, I guess, or what's the, if metaphor is what is really essential to making something poetic, why didn't people think about other things as poetry previous to say the 20th century or late 19th century?
Yeah. I think to start with why verse has been associated with poetry for so long. One thing that poetry really does is engages our emotions. And it does that. I think metaphor helps to do that in a way through, it gives us this surprising jump between one thing and another thing that we don't normally connect it with, and that is exciting to us. But I think verse and rhyme also help to do that. They provide this kind of rhythm that kind of like a dance, excites our emotion. And I guess we could then ask what the purpose of that is. As for more modern poetry that doesn't use verse, that might just be stemming from this idea that maybe metaphor is more important to poetry than verse. I think it also, though not using verse is able to convey something. Working within preset bounds helps to create certain expectations within your poem, and conveys a certain amount of meaning. And when you do away with that, I think a lot of philosophy and a lot of more recent philosophy has tended to focus more on the chaos that we see in the world rather than the order. And modern poetry, I think, tends to reflect that in a lot of ways, one of which is this not using standard verse and meter.
Thank you. That's helpful. One more question. I was intrigued by your note, maybe 3/4 of the way through your oration, sort of contrasting poetic expression and visual representation in different arts. They say that a picture is worth 1,000 words.
Yeah.
But you seem to say that it's the opposite, that a word is somehow of more value or more meaningful, conveys more. I wonder if you could unpack that that claim a little bit.
Yeah, I think for both visual art and verbal art, a lot, of course, depends on the skill of the person working in whatever medium he's using. I think that with visual art, it's much easier to see a painting or a sculpture and just say, oh, that's nice or that's beautiful, and walk away without doing. I think it might require more. It might draw us in less than poetry tends to do. Another difference is that with the medium of words, there's not so much of a barrier between our intellect and what we're seeing. With a visual art, we need to first see it, and it's easier to just appreciate the surface level, I guess, of something portrayed in visual art rather than poetry, because with poetry we expect there to be the deeper meaning of the poem that we like to talk about.
Thank you. That's helpful.
Thank you, James. I have one question that I think has two parts. So the first part is, let's say that I'm fired by your oration and I decide that tonight I'm going to go home and I'm going to write poetry.
Great.
Yes. Where should I start? Would you have practical advice? Is there a form that would be easier? Is there an author that would be easier to imitate? Are there any guidelines, any practical helps that you would offer us? That's part one. And then part two is, let's say I do that, I try to produce something and I find out I'm really terrible at it. What is there value even so in persisting? Is there value in my attempting to do this and producing something that's just not really good as poetry? Of course, if I keep doing it, I'll get better. But even at the initial stages, is there value in doing it poorly? And what would that value be?
Mm-hmm. Okay. So for the first part, are there practical helps to starting out writing poetry? I think reading good poetry is of great help for that. I think I really like the Romantic poets. I really like Wordsworth, and I think his poetry is a great example of just taking ordinary, everyday things and just thinking about them and trying to, just really think about the way that they affect us. That's part of the whole theory behind the way that he writes his poetry, and part of the whole Romantic movement, which is turning towards the ordinary so as to not lose our ability to appreciate anything besides the extraordinary. And then, again, just to cultivate this attitude of seeing connections between things. We talk a lot about transfer in our outdoor program. I think that's a really similar idea. Yeah. And then as to why it's good to write poetry, even if it seems really bad at first, I think that probably is necessarily going to be the case when you start out in any art. It takes a while to become proficient at it. One thing I would say is good to do with your poetry, though, is to show it to other people. Probably don't publish it, but do but do show it to your friends and have that in mind as you're writing it, that it's something that you do want to share with your friends, because it'll affect the care that you put into it, I think. And yeah.
Thank you. Questions from the audience?
Andrew.
Thanks, James. Kind of piggybacking off of Dr. Judd's question, do you think that along with the ability to see being in decline, the state of poetry is in decline? And if that's stemming from, like what you said earlier, of how the philosophers are kind of looking at the chaos of things and less on the order of things, do you think that the state of poetry today is in decline?
Yeah, I probably would say so. I haven't read a lot of contemporary poetry though, so but yeah, it seems like within the last century there have been less, I mean, even just less attempts at writing poetry. There are less people who even want to take the time to try to. And yeah, as you said, that's probably related to the culture in which we live, which is getting more and more fast-paced and utilitarian, which, yeah, is not conducive to the state of wonder that is necessary in order to contemplate things, in order to experience them as metaphors. Ben.
Thank you, James, for your oration. I know we've talked before about the madness that sort of descends on artists and poets. I'm thinking of like the annoying poets like Whisper. What is happening there? You sort of is it viewing the things you use too much as things you enjoy? Is it seeing something there that is not actually there, or too much emotion? Could you speak a bit more to what madness is?
Yeah. I don't think the madness is a bad thing. I mean, quit aside. No, I think maybe the madness looks like madness to the utilitarian society. It sees someone just, I don't know, looking at a rock for an hour, or a stream, or a bird, or something that doesn't seem worthy of the attention that it's receiving from a utilitarian standpoint. There's nothing that the poet is getting from what he's looking at. I guess what's also meant there is by this madness is, yeah, some sort of uncanny knowledge about things that you don't feel like you should be able to have. I think that's probably that's probably connected to like Maritain with creative intuition that he talks about, where it's not so much that you've like analyzed what you're writing about and compartmentalized it so much. I don't think the poet approaches his subject in a very philosophic way, even though, as Aristotle says, what he's doing is actually quite philosophical. He approaches it in a kind of a way that he assumes what he knows about it. And I think he's justified in that because of his close attentiveness to his subject, but not in like as I said, like a scientific analytical way, but I don't know, a kind of sympathy with the thing where he's imagining what it would be like to be the thing that he's portraying. Does that help at all? Armand?
I'm wondering, you brought in a dangerous quote using the Augustine use
in Doctrina.
Uh-huh.
And I'm just wondering if we're supposed to use creation so that we can enjoy the spiritual things. How does that not make poetry? Why is poetry then not just a utility for seeing those things? And then is it because poetry always seems to be like a free, something we do freely, not something that's like I'm here to gain knowledge. How does poetry not simply gets reduced to simply gaining knowledge about, like, as you're saying, like God? Because then if that was the case, like, why does not every poem talk about God? And is that like, is the end of poetry simply like just greater knowledge of God to see things, or is poetry trying to do something else?
No, well, I think all poetry does that does accurately represent what it's portraying, by the very fact that it helps us to understand reality, helps us to understand God, because God has made reality the way it is and put his perfection in all things. That's a pretty distant way of coming to know God, but I think it is like the only real way. I mean, we can have thunderbolt revelations that are great when they happen, but the natural way that God has made for us to come to know him, I think, is the best. This, like Emily Dickinson says, the circuitous way around to the fullness of truth. I feel like I'm missing a part of your question. Oh, you were asking about Augustine, enjoyment and use. Yeah, I've been equivocating on use. Yeah, when I say utilitarian, I don't mean use in the Augustinian sense, where we want to use things in order to enjoy things that are deserving of our enjoyment. He goes on to say that the things that are to be enjoyed are the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. So God. And I think that that's just a really good way of putting everything in perspective, that man is the only material creature for whom matter has eternal consequences. And so the only purpose that all of the rest of the material creation can serve is to bring us to God. And to, yeah. I don't think that when Augustine is saying that we need to use things in order to enjoy things that should be enjoyed, he's unduly demeaning the things by saying that we should use them. If that helps. Dad.
Thank you. So, yeah, I thought that your talk just stimulated such great questions from your panel, and I want to go back to some of these because it just drew, yeah. So this idea, if we talk about them as elements of poetry, maybe like you're really emphasizing the metaphor, and a metaphor is kind of a similarities that you see in dissimilarities. But the idea that, well, how is that related to, like, why is it that metaphor is it kind of a stalwart, but then we got meter and rhyme, and isn't rhyme, and also the other one you mentioned where it rhymes at the beginning instead of the end?
Alliteration.
Yeah, alliteration. Like, isn't it just another example of seeing similarities in where in our speech we got all these rhymes happening all the time, but we don't notice them, and the poet is the one that sees them, draws them out, just like he sees similarities in his experience and brings them out in, and draws them to the fore. Mm-hmm. So isn't it that really that really kind of the same thing is happening, that rhyme is a kind of a metaphor of words, mm-hmm. in alliteration. Mm-hmm. And then the next question further along was that what's happening in this modern day when people are moving away from the rhythm and rhyme, which I would say is a kind of the metaphor of the structure of the language, as opposed to as the actual metaphor being the structure of the content or the meaning. And I'm just wondering, I'm going to throw something out there and then you correct it as per what you're thinking, that as in the 20th century, people are saying, I'm going to, resile from this using bringing out the similarity in the structure and making it feel true, because it just has the ring of truth because it all rhymed. But I'm not satisfied with that. I want people to only judge it by the similarity, like the metaphor of the content. And that's why we're letting the structural the structural metaphorical, the rhyme and the rhythm go, because we want to challenge people to judge it on the merits of whether or not the similitudes that I'm drawing out are truly similar.
Yeah.
What is that? What's going on with the movement in the modern age, or what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that sounds kind of like what Socrates says in the Gorgias about speech makers who will make their speeches really entertaining so that people will want to believe them. But what we really want to do is the most important part of a speech is to lead the audience to truth. And so if we're not doing that, then what is enjoyable about the speech or the poem is actually detrimental. But I think also, so that could be true, that they're not using meter and rhyme and things like that in order to just have their poem be judged on the merit of what it's saying. But I think it also could be used in more nihilistic poetry that wants to just deny the similarity between anything or any kind of order in the world. Yeah. Mr. Shantz?
Last question.
Thank you, James. That was like a bubbling brook finding its way down alongside the springs.
What a beautiful metaphor.
Carol Hauslander wrote a essay on creativity, and in his essay, it highlighted the fact that as a human, we all need to find our medium to work with to express our creativity in terms of as a sub-creator or a co-creator with God. Do you see that writing poetry has, in a hierarchical way, a slightly higher place than the artist in terms of whatever medium that is, whether it's clay or wood, or is that kind of an equivalent way of expressing poetry?
Like I said, I think it just has a broader and a deeper range of expression over the visual arts. I haven't done really any painting or sculpting myself. And so that might just be purely subjective. But from my own experience, also just like looking at art and reading stories, I, for myself, find stories and poems more profound. They have a more profound effect on me than looking at art. I think also poetry is just very accessible to everyone to get started in. That's another example. That's kind of tangential to your question.
Yeah,
but
just really quick follow-up. I guess I'm thinking more as being the poet or being the artist, as opposed to, I think Dr. Judd's, you addressed more as appreciating it.
Okay. Yeah.
So
No, I think being the poet and being the artist do require this similar capability to pay very close attention to what you're conveying. But I think another thing that's really cool about poetry is that it does do this similar thing to what God is doing in creation, but doing it through words. Whereas the visual arts are just representing or like reportraying what you see in nature or city or whatever it's portraying. Is that getting more at what you were wondering?
I can follow up with you after.
Okay.
I'll leave that to you.
Yeah, I think there are many more questions, so please do continue the conversation with James afterwards. Let's thank him once again.
Thank you very much.
Well done.